I want to start with Immanuel Kant. My first historical thesis is that postmodernism is a consequence of a very deep skepticism. Kant published his Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. In my judgment, he is, along with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the most significant figure in the counter-Enlightenment. Now, in the case of Kant, obviously, you don't have to read far into Ayn Rand's writings to figure out that she thinks Kant's philosophy is the worst disaster of all time, that she holds his philosophy responsible for most of the irrationality and the destruction that has gone on in the last 2 centuries. But if you don't know very much about the history of philosophy before and after Kant, it's difficult to see why she singles out Kant. And in her brief and vehement remarks, she does not elaborate upon those, and mostly what they do is they point in a direction where a lot more reading and thinking and research needs to be done. So I'll make a gesture in that direction today. The central thesis that you find in the Critique of Pure Reason is that reason cannot know reality. It only knows its own subjective constructs. Kant's motivation, writing during the time the Enlightenment is flourishing, is religious. He can see that the religion is taking a beating at the hands of secular naturalistic philosophy. Religion is on the defensive. It's in danger, in fact, of being laughed out of intellectual life. He agrees, however, with the Enlightenment thinkers that religion cannot be justified by reason. And so, as he states in the second preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, I had, therefore, to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. So the whole project then of the critique is to show why reason cannot have knowledge of reality, and since it can't, that leaves the door open for faith as a means of coming to have beliefs about reality. Okay, so if you know anything about history of philosophy at this point, you can say, well, so what? Why is Kant special on these points? There are lots of earlier skeptics who said we can't know reality. Lots of earlier religious apologists had subordinated reason to faith. Okay, so what makes Kant special on these points? There are 2 things, I think. The first is that the earlier skeptics had not been as sweeping in their conclusions. They would pick off a particular cognitive operation and raise problems for them. Maybe it's all a perceptual illusion, so thus we undermine our confidence in our perceptual faculties. Maybe induction is only probabilistic, right? Thus undermining our confidence in all of our generalizations. But the conclusions of skeptical arguments would be simply that we can't be sure that we are right. We might be, but we can't prove it. Now, Kant's argument is deeper, arguing that in principle, any conclusion reached by any of our faculties must necessarily not be about reality. On principle, because our minds are structured in a certain way, we can't say what reality is. We can only say what the end result of what our minds structured is. And this is going to be completely general. No matter what cognitive faculty you pick out and focus on, that argument applies. So consciousness, with all of its faculties, is thus undermined in a very deep way. Kant is a landmark in a second respect. Earlier skeptics, despite their negative conclusions, continued to conceive of truth as a correspondence between mind and reality, or between consciousness and reality. Kant then went a step further and redefined truth on subjective grounds. If our minds are disconnected in principle from reality, then to speak of any type of conscious relationship, including truth, as a correspondence to a reality that we can't know, that makes no sense. And so we then need to redefine truth, not in terms of a correspondence to reality, but internally and subjectively. And for him, it's going to be an internal relationship of coherency and consistency. So what you find then with Kant is that external reality drops out of the picture totally. We can't know it, and we don't define truth in terms of it. And that is why Kant is a landmark. After Kant, the history of philosophy is the story of German philosophy. Kant died at the beginning of the 19th century, just as Germany was beginning to replace France as the world's leading intellectual nation. It is German philosophy that sets the program. Now I want to focus briefly on 2 strands in German philosophy in the 19th and the 20th century. One strand starts with Hegel and runs through Marx. Hegel is definitely the most important and influential German philosopher of the 19th century. Marx, not influential in the 19th, the most influential in the 20th. Both take off from Kant, but cast Kant's deepest conclusions in a different direction. For example, one of Kant's backup arguments to show that reason is impotent appears in a section starting about 2/3 of the way through the Critique of Pure Reason. The section is called The Antinomy of Pure Reason, and its purpose is to show that reason is way out of its depth when it tries to figure out deep truths about reality. Kant there develops 4 pairs of parallel arguments on 4 metaphysical issues, showing that on those issues, reason validly leads to contradictory conclusions. You can prove that the universe had a beginning in time, but you can equally soundly prove that the universe must be eternal. You can prove that the world must be made up of simplest parts, and also that it can't be, that we have free will, and that strict determinism is true, and that God must exist, and that God can't be proven to exist, or that he doesn't exist. This shows, Kant concludes, that we can never know reality. Because there what we're trying to do is know reality, but we are running into contradictions. Our reason, therefore, must be limited to internal stuff manipulating and reconstructing its own subjective creations. Now, Hegel thinks Kant has missed a deep point here. The antinomies are not a problem for reason, contrary to Kant, but rather the key to the whole universe. The antinomies of reason are only a problem if you think logical contradictions are a problem. And that was Kant's mistake. He was too trapped into the old Aristotelian logic of non-contradiction. What Kant's antinomies show is not that reason is limited, but that we need a new and better kind of reason, one that embraces contradictions and sees the whole of reality as evolving out of contradictory forces. Hegel also differs from Kant in adding an evolutionary component. Evolutionary ideas in the 19th century are in the air. Everyone is, in fact, laying the groundwork for Darwin's explanation in 1859. In contrast to Kant's belief that the subjective categories are necessary and unchanging, Hegel argues that the appropriate categories by which we structure reality are themselves evolving and relative. What is metaphysically and epistemologically true in one epoch will be contradicted by what is true in the next, and so on. Hegel differs from Kant in a third key respect. Groups, not individuals, are the operative units. Kant was way too individualistic. Men's minds are not autonomous. Autonomy was a key point for Kant. Rather, their minds are a function of deeper forces of the universe operating on them. Those deeper forces are primarily, for us as individuals, our surrounding culture, but we are constructed by our surrounding cultures. Cultures are made up of individuals, but rather cultures have an evolutionary life of their own, and those cultures, as they evolve, construct their constituent individuals as part of the process. Additionally, individuals are secondary in the ethically speaking, as Hegel puts it in his philosophy of history. Quote, individuals come under the category of means to an ulterior end. That ultimate end, so that was an end of quotation, this is me now, that ultimate end is collective, the process of society evolving toward its own ends, during which it must, of course, quote, trample down many an innocent flower, crush to pieces many an object in its path. Those objects are the recalcitrant individuals within a society. So that's Hegel. With Marx, we get a more materialistic and pretty much more bloody version of the same general outlook. All right, so what we get from Hegel and Marx are 3 key ideas. The group is the unit of analysis, not the individual. Deep truths evolve and change over time, and contradictions are to be embraced, right, as built into the nature of reason, and so forth. Now this Hegel-Marx framework is what I fondly like to call the pro-reason wing of German philosophy. Hegel loved to capitalize reason. It was always reason with a capital R. Marx called his socialism scientific socialism. There is a more irrationalist, deeply irrationalist line, the Romanticist line, that comes out of Kant's philosophy. And this one includes major figures such as Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and Denmark's lonely contribution to the history of philosophy, Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, born a generation after Kant, educated in Germany, was, like Kant, deeply worried by the beating religion had taken during the Enlightenment. He was delighted to learn from reading Kant that reason cannot reach noumena, or reality as it is. But where Kant hesitated here, saying that therefore the nature of reality is closed off to us, Kierkegaard says that that only proves you can't know reality by reason. What is needed is a non-rational access to reality. And in accordance with Kierkegaard's deeply felt religious needs, it's an irrational leap of faith that is necessary. The leap of faith has to be irrational, and you have to make the leap knowing that it's irrational. Because after the Enlightenment, we know that we can't prove the existence of God, and after the Enlightenment, we know that the traditional religion that we are making our leap into, the Judeo-Christian tradition, involves all kinds of bizarre paradoxes and contradictions. If you read, for example, Fear and Trembling, you will find Kierkegaard's panegyric to Abraham. That's the opening section of it. It's worth a read. Abraham is the hero, or one of the heroes of the Old Testament, who in defiance of all reason and all morality is willing to kill his son Isaac simply because God tells him so. Any rational person would raise all kinds of questions and say why this is not a good thing to do. Kierkegaard, or Abraham, is willing to turn his mind off. God commands, I take the leap, I believe, I do it. Kierkegaard reveres Abraham because he was willing to, as Kierkegaard puts it, crucify reason and leap into absurdity. Schopenhauer, also of the generation after Kant and a contemporary of Hegel's, agreed that Kant showed reason's inability to grasp reality. This, however, contrary to Kant, is because reality itself is deeply irrational and conflictual, so reason hasn't got a chance. Will and emotion are much deeper faculties than reason, and it is through will and emotion that we grasp the essence of reality. In the next generation, Nietzsche agrees. As he puts it in the second essay of his Genealogy of Morals, the problem with philosophers up to and including Kant was their emphasis on reason. The emphasis on reason means a loss of reliance upon instinct. Once the philosophers took over, men, quote, no longer possessed their former guides, their regulating, unconscious, and infallible drives. They were reduced to thinking, inferring, reckoning, coordinating cause and effect. These unfortunate creatures. They were reduced to their consciousness, their weakest and most fallible organ. And again, how pitiful, how shadowy and fleeting, how aimless and capricious the human intellect is. So what Nietzsche means then with his passionate exhortations to be true to oneself is to break out of the artificial and constricting categories of reason. Reason is a tool for weaklings. Weaklings who are afraid to be naked in the face of a cruel and irrational or conflictual reality, and who therefore build fantasy intellectual structures to hide in. The yaysayer, by contrast, the man of the future, will not be tempted to play word games, but he will tap into his deepest drives, his will to power, and he will channel all of his instinctual energies in a vital new direction. All right, so stepping back, what we get then from this other post-Kantian strand of philosophy is, again, three key themes. There's an agreement with Kant that reason is impotent or impotent to know reality, the claim that will and emotion trumps reason and yields deep truths about reality, and third, that reality is deeply conflictual or absurd. Death of Nietzsche in the 1900 brings us to the 20th century. And so what we need to do is find a way to bring together these two strands of German thought, to synthesize them for the new century. The philosopher who, in my judgment, does this more than anyone is Martin Heidegger. Heidegger, unquestionably the leading philosopher of the postmodernists. Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault said they were followers of Heidegger. Rorty, Richard Rorty, cites Heidegger as one of the three big guns influencing his thinking. Now, Heidegger himself places himself squarely in the Kantian tradition. Reason, as Kant said, is incapable of knowing reality. In fact, reason is our primary obstacle to knowing reality. Heidegger writes in an introduction to metaphysics, logic and reason would forbid us asking certain questions, such as, why is there being and not rather nothing? Or in our terminology, why does existence exist? If we say that there is a reason why, or an explanation for why existence exists, then we need, in effect, to step outside of existence to explain it. But if we step outside of existence, we step into nothing. We're going to explain existence from nothing. That you can get something from nothing. And that's absurd. Either way we go, we're deep into absurdity. But this doesn't stop Heidegger. Logic, right, would say that the question is ill-formed. It's contradictory, so the question should be set aside. Existence exists, that's your axiom, you go from there. On the other hand, switching to a Heideggerian first-person perspective, these questions strike a very deep feeling in me. So here I have a conflict. Logic and reason say the question is contradictory and should be set aside, but my feelings urge me to explore the question in a nonverbal, emotional way. Fortunately, as we've learned, this conflict is yet another sign that logic and reason are impotent. Right? And as we know by now, we should expect to find conflict and contradiction at the heart of things. Contradiction is a sign that we're on to something important. Deep feeling, therefore, trumps logic. And the next step is, of course, if we're honest, when we all consult our core feelings, we find ourselves full of dread, anxiety, and all that other cool stuff Kierkegaard talked about, and then we're off into an existentialist wallow. With Heidegger, what we get is the two lines integrated. The lessons post-Heideggerians can take from him are, and I've got 6 of them here. I think, yeah, they all should be right there. Conflict and contradictions are the deepest truths about reality. Reason is subjective, impotent. Logical contradiction isn't an argument against anything. Feeling is a deeper guide than reason. Authenticity requires a deeply felt leap into conflict and paradox. And secondly, that you embrace collectivism. Now, I just assert that last one for now without argument. But in Heidegger, you find a very deep collectivism of the nationalistic variety. His sympathies with the Nazis are evidence of this, but in all of his deep philosophical writings, you find a view that authentic living requires that you consciously absorb into yourself your cultural tradition, that you see yourself as part of the development and flow of your people's tradition. All right, so that's my reading of the essence of the continental tradition in philosophy, as it's called. After Kant, the continental tradition fairly quickly and gleefully abandoned reason, putting clashing wills and troubled emotion at the forefront. And in the continental tradition, obviously, we can find a lot of the ingredients of postmodernism. Now, this leaves a problem, because this can't be the whole story, because there's a gap. Postmodernism is thriving in the American Academy here. And in the American Academy, for the longest time, it had little use for Hegel, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger. The Anglo-American tradition, in contrast with Hegel's speculative wanderings and Kierkegaard's wallowings, it allied itself with science, with rigor, with reason, with objectivity. It had been deeply impressed with science, and it saw science as an alternative to the now discredited religious and speculative philosophy. It wanted to make philosophy scientific, and it wanted to justify the roots of science. This positivist spirit, broadly speaking, pro-science, pro-logic, dominated the Anglo-American scene for much of the 19th century and at least half of the 20th century. And so it's got to be the collapse of that positivistic spirit in American philosophy that is also part of the story of the rise to postmodernism. Beginning of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell foreshadows what's to come. In the final chapter of an often read introductory book called The Problems of Philosophy, published in 1912, beginning of the century. Russell summarizes the history of philosophy as a repeating series of failure after failure to answer its questions. Can we prove there's an external world? No. Can we prove that there's cause and effect? No. Can we validate any of our generalizations? No. Can we find an objective basis for morality? No way. Russell concludes, therefore, that philosophy can't answer its questions. We've been trying forever, got nowhere, must not be answerable. And so he comes to believe that any value philosophy has can't be in offering truth or wisdom. It's got to be somewhere else. Ludwig Wittgenstein and the early logical positivists took the problem one step further. Why has philosophy traditionally failed to answer any of its questions? Well, because those questions are meaningless. The mistake earlier philosophers had made was thinking that philosophy was about its own unique subject matter. But that's wrong. Philosophy has no content as such. No metaphysics, no ethics, no theology, no aesthetics. Those are all content and they're all meaningless. This means we need to recast philosophy's function. Philosophy is not a content discipline, it's a method discipline. Its function is analysis, hence the name analytic philosophy, and it should see itself as an assistant to science. So the purpose then of philosophy in this newer analytic tradition is to analyze the perceptual, linguistic, and logical tools that science uses. Scientists perceive, organize their observations linguistically in concepts and propositions, and then structure those linguistic units using logic. Philosophy's job then is to figure out what perception, language, and logic are all about. So what, in a nutshell, has 20th century Anglo-American philosophy had to say about perception, language, and logic? Well, the dominant conclusion about perception is that it is theory-laden. That means that all of our perceptions have theory built into them, what we see. Karl Popper, Norwood Hanson, Paul Feyerabend, Thomas Kuhn, four of the biggest names in the 20th century philosophy of science, all argue that our theories largely dictate what we will see. Now, if this is true, perception then is hardly a neutral and independent check upon our theorizing. Putting it in Kant's original language, our perceptual intuitions do not conform to objects. Rather, our intuitions conform to what our faculty of knowledge supplies from itself. Our conceptual structures shape our observations, not vice versa, and so we are stuck inside a subjective system with no direct access to reality. Similar conclusions are reached for language and logic. Language and logic are a conventional, internal system, not objective reality-based tools of consciousness. The positivists, taking Wittgenstein and Carnap as leading examples, and the pragmatists, here taking Quine and Ernest Nagel as leading examples, agree on this. As Wittgenstein puts it in the Tractatus, all the propositions of logic say the same thing. That is, nothing. They say nothing because they are merely a function of how we have decided to use words. But how we use words is conventional. We could have decided differently. We could carve the world up differently with our words. So if language and logic are conventional, then the rules of logic and language hardly say anything about objective reality. And so logical proof cuts no mustard in adjudicating competing claims about fact. Also, if the rules of logic and language are conventional, well, what's to stop someone from adopting different conventions? Nothing. The rules of logic and grammar can be as variable as other conventions, including performance, how we greet each other. Do we shake hands, rub noses, hug, or what? None of them is more objectively right than the others. Now, by the 1950s, the Rui's conclusions are commonplace. Next step is Thomas Kuhn's publication in 1962, his monumental Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The science's tools are perception, logic, and language. Then science, one of the Enlightenment's prize children, is merely an evolving, socially subjective enterprise with no more claim to objectivity than any other belief system. So I see Kuhn as, in effect, integrating everything that went on beforehand. So by the 1960s, really the pro-science, pro-objectivity spirit that had animated much of Anglo-American philosophy has collapsed. The next step is Richard Rorty's, best known of the American postmodernists, and he generalizes the point to anti-realism. As Kant had said 200 years ago, we can say absolutely nothing about noumena, about what's really real. Rorty's anti-realism is exactly the same point. The idea that we can speak about what's real is just an illusion. There are no objective answers, there's no truth, there are only truths, and truths change. Now, once these conclusions are reached about knowledge and science, the Anglo-American tradition is ready to take seriously Kierkegaard, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. And this is what we start to see happening in the 1960s. All right, after this whirlwind tour then of 200 years of Western philosophy, I can now summarize and offer my first hypothesis about the origins of postmodernism. All of the key ingredients of postmodernism are laid out for them by 20th century philosophers. Most of 20th century philosophy, however, has not been systematic. It's been anti-systematic on principle for the most part. It's been developed in a piecemeal fashion. Postmodernism is the first synthesis, the first system putting together all of the pieces. You've got metaphysical anti-realism, epistemological subjectivity, feeling at the root of all value issues, the consequent relativism of knowledge, relativism of values, the collectivism, the anti-science attitudes are all integrated into a totality. Once we set our reality and reasoning aside, what's left? Well, we have our feelings. When we inspect our feelings, what do we find? Well, from Kierkegaard and Heidegger, we get a deep sense of dread and guilt. From Marx, we get a deep sense of victimization and rage. From Nietzsche, we get a deep sense of a need for power. From Freud, we get a welling up of dark, smutty sexuality. Where do these feelings come from? Well, they're determined, either biologically or environmentally. In either case, I am not individually in control of my feelings. I am a product of my group membership, whether it's economic, sexual, or racial. And of course, the shaping experiences vary from group to group, so differing individuals and different groups have no common experiential framework. There is no objective standard by which to mediate those different feelings. No appeal to reason is obviously possible. Nasty political correctness then makes perfect sense. That's how you impose your group's agenda on other groups. Postmodernism then is the end result of the counter-Enlightenment inaugurated by Kant's epistemology.